Picture this. You're north of Medina, surrounded by these incredibly harsh, jagged volcanic rocks, and suddenly, carved right into this dramatic terrain, is a lush, fertile valley. This was Khaybar. It was an incredibly wealthy oasis, and it was guarded by a sprawling, seemingly impenetrable network of fortresses. Today, we're going to dive into a historical event that was way more than just a simple clash of armies. We're looking at an absolute masterclass in logistics, geography, and psychological warfare that permanently altered the geopolitical map of the Middle East.
Welcome to this explainer. We're going back to 628 CE, when a rapid, highly secret 3-day march toward this very oasis shifted the entire balance of power in Arabia. We'll be unpacking the strategic, geographic, and economic nuances of a siege that truly reshaped the early Islamic community. And we're going to do this by combining early historical storytelling with military strategy and modern academic research to figure out exactly how and why this legendary oasis fell.
So here's our roadmap for today. We'll journey from the shifting political alliances in Medina right through to the incredible wealth of the oasis, the siege tactics, our historical sources, and finally, the lasting economic and political legacy of the campaign.
Let's jump right into Section 1, the road to Khaybar. Okay, let's set the stage. It's the aftermath of the harrowing Battle of the Trench in 627 CE and the pivotal peace treaty with Mecca at Hudaybiyyah the very next year. The Muslim community in Medina found themselves in a really unique position. Their southern flank, suddenly secure from the Quraysh, but they were facing a massive existential threat coming from the north. The exiled leaders of the Banu Nadir tribe had settled in Khaybar, and from there they were actively paying and organizing allied Arabian tribes, like the incredibly powerful Ghatafan, to launch strikes against the Muslims. So neutralizing Khaybar wasn't just some optional military expedition for Prophet Muhammad, it was an absolute strategic imperative for their survival.
Moving right along to Section 2, the wealthy oasis fortress. Think about this for a second. 150. That is how many kilometers northwest of Medina Khaybar was situated. Getting an entire army there in total secrecy was a monumental logistical nightmare. I mean, you can't just casually march a massive force across 150 kilometers of open desert without being spotted by scouts from the Ghatafan or other allied tribes. And when they finally got there, it wasn't just one big castle they had to take. The oasis was divided into 3 distinct, highly defensible regions: Al-Natat, Al-Shik, and Al-Katiba. These zones were separated by natural lava drifts and actual swamps, and they contained between 8 to 13 formidable fortresses, like Kanmus and Naim. And these weren't just built on the ground, they were raised high up on natural basalt rocks. This brilliant use of geography meant any attacker was forced to fight multiple isolated sieges rather than having one big, open battlefield. But here's the thing you have to understand. Khaybar was an absolute economic juggernaut. Historical sources tell us their massive storehouses contained an actual siege engine, thousands of swords, lances, and shields, 20 bales of fine cloth, 500 cloaks for trade, and of course, these unparalleled massive date harvests. It was exactly this vast wealth that allowed them to literally buy mercenaries and fund neighboring tribes to attack the Muslims. Which brings us to Section 3, the Siege of Khaybar. The asymmetry of this conflict is just wild. You have a Muslim force of maybe 1,400 to 1,800 men, with only about 100 to 200 horses, marching against an entrenched Khaybar fighting strength that could rally up to 10,000 men. To counter this massive disadvantage, the Muslims executed a rapid, forced march, covering that ground in just 3 days. The ultimate goal? Complete and total surprise. And according to historical reports, the element of surprise was literally perfect. The defenders had no idea the army was at their gates until the sun came up. Imagine being a laborer in Khaybar. You walk out to your fields in the morning with your spade and basket, and suddenly you see a Muslim army. They fled in panic, crying out, "Muhammad with his force," to which the Prophet famously replied, "Allah Akbar, Khaybar is destroyed. When we arrive in a people's square, it is a bad morning for those who have been warned." This incredible, immediate shock marked the dramatic kickoff of what would become a grueling month-long siege. Now, the siege itself was a brutal test of human endurance. Using brilliant military strategy, the Prophet physically cut Khaybar off from their Ghatafan allies, which meant absolutely no reinforcements were coming. But the flip side, the Muslim soldiers were now essentially trapped in hostile territory.
They faced extreme hunger and freezing cold, subsisting mostly on roasted grain and water, all while meticulously trying to advance on those fortresses. So why did Khaybar's defenses ultimately fail? Well, despite their incredible wealth and the high ground, there was a fatal flaw: a lack of central authority among the defending families. Instead of forming a unified defensive network that could easily outflank the attackers, they just hunkered down as isolated strongholds. This gave the much smaller Muslim army the opportunity to patiently storm each redoubt individually, moving methodically from one basalt hill to the next under the cover of heavy archery fire.
Let's pivot to Section 4, Leaders and Historical Sources.
How do we actually know all of this? To maintain real academic balance in this explainer, we have to look at our two main bodies of source material because they actually paint very different pictures. On one hand, you've got early Islamic historians, guys like Ibn Ishaq and al-Tabari. They give us the macro view, right? The grand troop movements, the political alliances, the overarching strategy. But then on the other hand, we have the hadith collections, like Bukhari and Muslim. These give us the visceral, boots-on-the-ground reality. They're the ones telling us what the soldiers were eating, how intensely cold they were, and the specific ethical prohibitions the Prophet laid down during the chaos of war.
And these classical sources also give us the details of the legendary leadership that finally broke the stalemate. Easily the most famous moment of the siege was when Ali ibn Abi Talib was given the standard. The histories tell us he famously dueled and slew the formidable Jewish commander, Marhab. This singular event caused an absolute catastrophic collapse in Khaybar's morale, turning the tide of the entire campaign. It just goes to show that individual leadership on the battlefield was just as crucial as the overarching macro strategy.
Which brings us to Section 5, Economic and Political Aftermath.
Here is a number that might actually surprise you: 111. Despite the massive scale of the armies, remember, we're talking up to 10,000 defenders and nearly 2,000 attackers, and a grueling month-long siege with heavy archery fire, the total fatalities were incredibly low. Historical records point to around 93 Jewish defenders and 18 Muslim soldiers losing their lives. A casualty rate of just 111 people out of over 12,000 combatants is staggering. It really speaks to the reality of siege warfare in late antique Arabia. Psychological pressure and controlling supply lines often dictated the outcome way more than sheer bloodshed. So following the surrender, a pretty monumental agreement was struck. Rather than exiling the inhabitants, the Prophet allowed them to stay and continue cultivating their rich date palms in exchange for half of their produce. This specific agricultural tax agreement did a lot more than just end a battle. It laid the fundamental, real-world groundwork for future Islamic laws regarding dhimmi, which deals with the protection, rights, and taxation status of non-Muslim citizens living under Muslim rule.
And finally, Section 6, Legacy and Modern Memory.
Ultimately, the fall of Khaybar was the critical domino that secured the survival of the Muslim community. By neutralizing that northern threat, the Muslims completely isolated their main rivals, the Quraysh, down south in Mecca. It provided a massive economic windfall that funded further expansion, completely shifted the balance of Arabian power, and for the believers, it fulfilled a Quranic promise of abundant victory. Almost overnight, they transitioned from a besieged city-state in Medina into a supreme regional power. But listen, the memory of Khaybar is far from confined to ancient history books. Looking at this from a purely academic standpoint, we can see how the event's legacy has been adopted into the modern Arab-Israeli conflict. During the First Intifada in the late 1980s, the historical siege was literally repurposed into a political rallying slogan by militant groups. It's a powerful demonstration of how ancient historical memory, events separated by over 1,000 years, can be actively mobilized and weaponized in modern political discourse today. So I want to leave you with this final thought to chew on. How does truly understanding the strategic, economic, and human complexities of a 7th-century desert siege reshape our view of diplomacy, alliances, and warfare in the modern Middle East? Because as we've seen, history is rarely just left in the past. It's the very foundation of our present. Thank you so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the history that shapes our world today.